we have more police interacting with people, having them on the streets, we can prevent crimes. We can prevent petty crimes from turning into something worse. But we also have to have an organized effort against gangs. Just as in a previous generation, we had an organized effort against the mob. We need to take these people on. They are often connected to big drug cartels. They are not just gangs of kids anymore. They are often the kinds of kids that are called super predators. No conscience, no empathy.
They resistant and committed to what you're saying, cause they can flip it the minute that you refrain. Read the book and the lines and literature in between. They gotta be educated when going against the grain. Pay attention, they are legitimate in their claims. They assisted in the killing and pillaging. In addition to the addiction, shit is much bigger than just in plain.
What up, y'all? BAM TV. Today we got a new series. It's called Player Profile, in which we highlight people who negatively affected our culture. Today we speak on the Clintons and their infamous 94 crime bill. Check this out.
As a week of pretrial motions ended today in the case of the 4 Los Angeles policemen already indicted in the Rodney King beating, the county grand jury signaled that will be the extent of the criminal case. 17 other so-called police bystanders at the beating scene will not be indicted. A development noted with frustration by the Los Angeles County Attorney, whose office presented the evidence.
Now, however morally wrong their failure to intercede, in California law there is no criminal statute under which these officers can be indicted.
The inaction of the 17 officers may now be investigated by the U.S. Attorney's Office for possible civil rights violations. But of greater concern, said the county attorney, are the results of interviews with some of the police bystanders.
So if Bush says fast-track jobs in Mexico, we say no, we got to fight for our job. But if Clinton says NAFTA, we say, well, NAFTA that's a little different. It's the same thing. If Reagan had proposed a Howard Johnson 60 new flavors of killing plan, if Reagan had proposed $10 billion in new prison construction, while school systems in D.C. closed because of lack of capital improvement, and others should be closed for the same reason, there have been massive demonstrations. Reagan could not have put through this crime bill. Bush could not have put through this crime bill. It's a combination of Kool-Aid and cyanide. And those who try to trade Kool-Aid off from cyanide didn't read Jim Jones' story. You cannot make that distinction. This is a criminal act.
The Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, better known as the 94 Crime Bill, is an act of Congress dealing with crime and law enforcement. It became law in 1994. It was the largest crime bill in the history of the United States and consisted of 356 pages that provided for 100,000 new police officers and $9.7 billion in funding for prisons. Here was supposed to be $6.1 billion in funding for prevention programs. From my assumption, I would assume that would be for infrastructure regarding schools, after-school programs, stuff like that, jobs for the community. Clearly, no money was spent towards that. It was also enacted by your man, Bill Clinton, and was brought to legislation by Sleepy Joe Biden. Pay attention.
It was so eloquent. He said, you know, I live in a good neighborhood. I go to a nice school. You wouldn't think people like me would care about this crime bill, but I have been keeping up with it every day because every time I go out with my friends at night to a movie or to a game, I think someone might shoot me before I get home. Now I feel so much better. My fellow Americans, this is about freedom.
Hillary was a pretty vocal supporter of mass incarceration when it was introduced by then-President Bill Clinton during the 90s. In 1994, he signed the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act. It gave us tougher sentences, more prisons, more cops in the streets, and the federal 3 strikes provision. That meant that if you were charged with a violent crime 3 times, you were off to prison for life, even if those crimes were relatively minor.
The correct term is called truth in sentencing. Here is where you have the three strikes law, in which state law requires the state courts to hand down mandatory and extended periods of incarcerations to a person who have been convicted of a criminal offense on multiple occasions. So essentially, as we all know, 3 felonies you out of that, and they can give you life. Is up to them. So pay attention.
It's now been 25 years since the 1994 crime bill. It's time to repeal it. And it's abundantly clear putting more people in prison hasn't made us safer. What it has done is decimate communities of color and rip families and communities like mine apart. The 1994 crime bill was written by a bunch of politicians who wanted to show they were tough on crime. So they passed mandatory minimums and tougher sentences, 3 strikes and you're out laws, and many more arrests for drug offenses. The bill gave states billions of dollars to build more prisons and keep people in prison longer. The result, the crime bill has filled our nation's prisons and jails with our fellow Americans, most of them Black or Latino. We spent and keep spending billions of dollars on incarceration and enforcement instead of prevention. In the 1990s, politicians, Democrats and Republicans literally supported cuts to welfare and social services while building more prisons as a response to poverty and disinvestment in communities of color.
As you heard the man say, they cut federal funding for welfare and social services. But if you look in the bill, it says they spent $6.1 billion in funding for prevention programs. My question to that would be, do you consider welfare and social services prevention programs? I do. So if that's the case, that means you did the latter. And history actually proves this. So instead of spending the 6.1, you cut 6.1 and you invest all of that into the prisons. And in also doing that, you also enact the 3 strikes rules, 3 strikes laws, which gives incentive to states to give mandatory sentencings of a 3-time felon life. Check this out.
Last Sunday, I was in Maryland, and Senator Sarbanes told me that already one of our community policing grants had resulted in the capture of a serious felon in a community in his state. This will make a difference, and I want to commend the Attorney General and the Justice Department for being determined to do this right, to get this money out to the grassroots so that we can hire the police and get on with the job.
Joining me now, former U.S. Congressman from Maryland, former chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, Kwesi Mfume. It's wonderful to have you.
It's good to be here.
You represented Baltimore in the 1990s when the crime bill came before you, and when crime was very high compared to what it is now, and when the national political discussion was more cops, more punishment, more jail. What's changed?
Well, we got more crime, we got more despair, we got more poverty, and we got more distrust. I mean, trying to do this in a bill that was flawed, they put some stuff in it to sweeten it up, was really not the answer. The core of all that you are seeing and that the nation is seeing is the fact that poverty, despair, homelessness, hunger, deprivation, degradation continues in these communities. You can't box it in with a piece of legislation.
Agreed. You can't box it in with a piece of legislation, especially if that legislation is heavily weighed on the enforcement side and not the prevention side, the people side. Again, they spent $9.7 billion in funding for prisons. So that's punishment, right? You're not worried about trying to fix the problem. You're just worried about how you're going to punish it. Again, $6.1 billion was supposed to be in funding for prevention programs. But in proof of history, we've seen that they actually cut down on federal funding from welfare and social services. So for a group of people that heavily depended on that, what did you make them? Pay attention.
Whose names we will never know. Early in 1992, I was walking through one of the countless kitchens of a hotel lobby in New York on my way to a dinner when a waiter working there came up to me and grabbed me and he said, "Mr. President," he didn't call me governor then, he said, "My 10-year-old boy is studying this election in school, and he says I should vote for you. But," he said, "I want to tell you something first. I came here as an immigrant, and the place where I lived was very poor, and we were very poor. But at least we were free. Now we live here and we have more money, but we are not free. We are not free because my boy can't walk across the street and play in the park unless I am with him. We are not free because my boy cannot walk to school unless I am with him. Make my boy free."
The community needs a conversation. But what they're saying is, look at me, I exist. Don't look away from me anymore.
Did you vote the wrong way on the crime bill in 94?
Here's the thing about the crime bill in 1994. There was no vote. It was a voice vote. So you didn't even have to be there. It was all in favor, aye, all opposed, no, and that's how it passed.
And that's how uncontroversial the idea was. More cops, 3 strikes. President signed an executive order.
41 new categories for the death penalty.
41 new.
Increase in the amount of money for prisons, decrease in the amount of money for prevention. You know?
And that was unanimous. That was just a unanimously held opinion across both parties.
Well, you know, when you have a vote and say all in favor, aye, all opposed, no, and there is no roll call, you just sort of sweep it under the rug and assume that everybody's going to support it.
And here you have your player profiles, Hillary and Bill Clinton. Let's start with Hillary. Hillary was the Secretary of State under the Obama administration. She was also the senator of New York, a state senator of New York, along with being the First Lady of the United States. Her husband, Bill, became the 42nd President of the United States. And he was also the governor of Arkansas. They both attended Yale University. They're important because they ushered in the 94 crime bill, a bill that ushered in mass incarceration, pushed through legislation to federally fund both federal and privately owned prisons. It also gave 100,000 new police officers in all the states in the United States, and it also gave incentive for those police officers to enact the truth in sentencing rule, or the 3 strikes law, in which a convicted felon, if convicted 3 times, could serve a sentence of life, or at least mandatory sentencing, in which they would serve at least 85% of the sentence that was handed down to them. So in other words, they hit us with the ooh-wop, and they shaking on us, bro. They getting everything. So they weren't trying to help us, man. We got to smarten up, you know what I'm saying? And we got to start trying to either A, get in office, get some real ones in there, so we can vote some laws for us. Or we got to just work with us, man. Period. Well, either way, y'all like, share, subscribe, man. We got more on the way. Much love.